it calms down in the next few years, but probably not for a few.
I think what's interesting, there are multiple interesting things here, but one of them is that on the one hand, if I understand both of you correctly, then a lot of the things that have been playing out in the last decade or so is kind of a natural phenomenon. Either from a Chinese perspective that it's a restoration, so it's a kind of normalization of the geopolitical weight of the country in a global aspect, but also from a Western perspective, meaning that the earlier economic, trade, and other policies sort of quote unquote bear fruit in what happened in the last few years, and basically. The Russian invasion of Ukraine since 2022 is kind of a benchmark in this regard, because it basically gives you kind of a probe of its impacts. So do you get a country completely isolated or not in the international economic environment? What comes to mind to me is basically the various models of international politics and also economics. So there's one narrative, for example, that this is a Western American narrative, if I may say so, that you have the quote-unquote liberal international order, which was established after or in the wake of the Second World War through economic, political, security and other institutions, and it has been reformed throughout the last few decades or so several times. You can argue whether it's successfully or not, but basically it's the order that we have right now. And I recall that one of the recent reforms was meant to occur more than 10 years ago, when, if you take a look at the international literature, you see the concept of the BRICS countries and global governance. So you have emerging powers, or powers who restore their clout, their position in the world, and they basically take part in global governance. But this narrative suggests that they take their respective places in the already established, order, whether it's formal or informal. And nobody really raised the idea of what happens if those emerging powers don't necessarily want to play along that particular rule or order, but whether they can offer an alternative model. So my question to you, both of you, is: do you think that this change that occurs right now in the world is the emerge of not just multiple poles in international politics, but also several models when it comes to political systems, when it comes to economy and trade, or even concepts of civilization, if for that matter. So can we talk about distinguishable models here, like Western models and Eastern models, or this is just too early to tell? What do you think about that? Go ahead.
Yes. Well, I don't like to use the word model, because model always means something well developed, already established, and also you have the motive, you have the drive to apply that model to other cultural setting. Now, from Chinese point of view, we never used the phrase China model. That's what you see in the Western press more often, Chinese trade. Look, the fundamental way of thinking in China historically would be any value system can only have its local roots. You cannot apply some system or model to a cultural setting where there is no that particular kind of cultural roots. Now here, from Chinese point of view, that will be the Confucian or Confucianism or Confucian cultural context. Chinese never, if you look at history, China never developed the concept of colonialism in the European sense. Now, colonialism in the European sense means you actually you send your own people to resettle in the territories which is far away from your motherland. Okay, that's in that sense, because it does not make sense. Okay, we had the first navy established around the 12th century, which is the strongest navy we all know. Paul Kennedy used to say, what if Chinese in 12th century decide to take over North America, even Australia? Well, forget about Columbus, forget about Vasco da Gama. But the Chinese fleet, which is the strongest ever in history by that time, suddenly decide to terminate all the activities by Chinese imperial court for a very simple reason. They don't see it as an opportunity to resettle your people to a alien or different cultural setting, which they believe is never going to work. So this is one, I would say, perspective which is quite unique in our history. Okay, but the other point I want to emphasize, the question of model. We are really talking about this model, that model. We really talk about is a debate over how to define legitimacy of a political regime. Now, what China disagree with is the established value system, which pretty much arising from the European Enlightenment to, I would call it Enlightenment orthodoxy. That's to say, you have to have particular kind of political system according to that principle. Divisions of power, broadly called democracy. You can only be legitimate if you establish that system. If you have a system different from the European style of democracy, you automatically consider illegitimate. So here, in Hungary, I'm so happy to hear, Hungary is sometimes being called illiberal democracy or something like this. From Chinese point of view, that expression is almost absurd. It makes no sense to using these kind of concepts to describe a particular system that actually fit their own culture pretty well. Okay, so here I think this is where Chinese again disagree with model. Chinese concept of legitimacy means a government which can actually deliver, livelihood to people, defending people, and improve by steps of the people's livelihood. So if that's, it's good enough to be considered legitimate government. Okay, it is not the form of government that matters. It is the deeds of the government, actions of government that matters. So here, I think that's the reason I explained Chinese hate to use the concept of two models fighting. We don't have a model, in fact. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you've given me a fantastic opportunity to plug my book, so thank you very much. It's out at the end of the month, and there is a Hungarian translation coming out. It's called The Collapse of Global Liberalism, and that's basically what I think's happening right now. It's actually kind of similar to what the professor said. In the Enlightenment, a system of ideas arose in Western Europe that you can call Enlightenment ideas. I suppose I'd probably refer to them as liberal ideas. And these had a universalist aspiration, as it were, and they spread throughout the West. They are deeply tied up with Western imperialism and so on, but and probably inevitably. But even beyond that, they are about the idea that everybody would end up signing on to these ideas and run their governments in such a way. And that's collapsing right now because it was always a bit of a dream. I'm not even convinced that the liberal ideas really ever took hold in the West until the past 30 years, to be honest. I think the West was mainly a Christian civilization up until then. If you think back to obviously not here, it was under communism, of course, but if you think back to America in the 1950s, I think you're probably talking about more of a Christian civilization than a liberal society, as we call it now. I think since the end of the Cold War, liberalism has become very powerful in Western countries. I'm from Ireland myself. I remember the changes. I was not born in a liberal country, but my country currently is a very liberal country. But it's all kind of falling apart now because the universalist claims that the people who express these ideas stated found out that they were fantasies, and they found out that they were fantasies in various waves. You know, I mean, the first was probably the invasion of Iraq, realizing that you'd land troops on the ground there, and they don't want to be part of your liberal system. Then the rise, or if you want to call it the reemergence of China, all these liberal theorists, Francis Fukuyama and so on, would have said, well, they'll just engage in commerce and so on, and they'll suddenly become like us. Well, China had been a commercial society since the dawn of its civilization, in a sense, and so it's absolutely no surprise to me that when China develops economically, it develops in its own way. So what we're actually probably returning to after the collapse of liberalism is global liberalism, if you want to call it that, is a return to the normal civilizational norms that we've seen throughout history. I mean, China's an obvious example, but I'll give you a few others. India, it's a democracy, but it's not a liberal democracy. India is clearly developing along Hindu nationalist lines. We'll see what it turns out to be, but it's not developing a liberal government, and there's no appetite there. If you go and talk to younger Indian nationalists, many of them educated at Oxford and Cambridge in England, and they still embrace these ideas. Another example might be Turkey. What's going on in Syria right now looks very much so like the reemergence of an Ottoman-style arrangement. Now, we'll see how far it goes, but that'll be a neo-Ottoman conception. Certainly, Erdogan's government and the general culture in Turkey strikes me as very Ottoman in its nature and its aspirations. You could talk about Iran as a new Persian empire. What's going on in the Red Sea right now, you could see that as part of a reemergence of the Persian Empire. So I think ultimately the question for the West is that the Western countries have become so convinced, and only very recently, in my living memory in my own country, have become very convinced of these liberal ideas, and they're falling apart around them. So the real question is, can they actually revive their sense of civilization, which was never a liberal civilization? Western European civilization is very clearly a Christian civilization, and it's a very old one. So I think that's the core question for the West, but no matter whether we figure that out or not, it's very clear that the rest of the world has said, yeah, those liberal ideas, we're not very interested in them, and we're going to develop along our own very natural civilizational track, and I think it will be in our interest to respect that.
Yeah, I recall I believe it was the 2015 National Security Strategy during the Obama years, which basically made a hint about the Arab Spring at the time. Well, in hindsight, at the time that, some say that culture and civilization are the primary defining issues when it comes to political systems, but we believe that there are certain universal systems and institutions, like liberal democracy, which basically along the Fukuyama lines could spread across the world. In layman's terms, if you basically give liberal democracy to certain tribes or groups or wherever in the world, then give them time, and basically they will develop kind of the same thing that you have in, I don't know, Brussels, Los Angeles, or Paris, or Budapest, or wherever in the West. And we clearly see that's not the case. At least culture does matter. At the same time, both of you mentioned the civilizational aspect, but also the ideological aspect. And it's clear that however things will turn out, it's clear that there's a tension, there's a turbulence in the international system right now. Just think of the tariff wars, for example, or the Trumpian idea of how we can, change the dynamics or alter the dynamics in international trade, economy, and so forth, or the post-hegemonic world. There are all kinds of words to describe it. The thing is, what I'm trying to get to at here is, do you think that this turbulence, this current, dare I say, tension, and do correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this current tension comes from a cause rooted in civilizational different concepts, so different ideas. We just don't use the same terms, we don't use the same language, literally and figuratively speaking as well, or it's an ideological problem, mainly within the West, that yeah, we do have a shared civilization, along the Huntingtonian lines, but even within certain civilizations, we just cannot get on on the same platform ideologically, and this creates a huge tension. And then we start to throw around all kinds of liberal, progressive, conservative, nationalist, populist, all kinds of terms. So my question here is, which is causing the tension between great powers or emerging and higher and currently ruling powers? Is it a civilizational aspect rather, or it's an ideological political aspect, or maybe both?
Well, from my perspective, I don't really think Trump is the problem, despite trade war or the disruptions he created. When you think about Trump, what's wrong with him? Well, when you read his inaugural speech seriously, or you take him willing to take him seriously, you see two messages which I think make a lot of sense, maybe more than even many liberal Americans would admit. Two messages. One is, I start a common sense revolution. The second message is, I will never be a world police anymore, which Americans have been doing for decades since the Second World War. What's wrong with that? I do not see anything wrong with that concept. Okay. Now, what Trump meant common sense, which was dismissed by many commentators, saying his empty words and so on. No, my reading of Trump's common sense actually might go back all the way to the American Revolution. That little pamphlet written by a British renegade at the time is Thomas Paine, who wrote this 46-page best-selling little pamphlet, which in part directly triggered the revolution at the time. I'm not trying to say Trump is a philosopher or he read all these academic, ivory tower stuff. No, he doesn't care. But my understanding is he intuitively understood what common sense meant for the Americans. Now, Thomas Paine common sense means the key point, if you go back to reread his little pamphlet, is that the common people or ordinary people actually know what's their best interest. Don't let elite tell us what is best for us. This is where the sudden collapse of liberal America, which Trump actually understood that intuitively. Okay? So it's anti-elite for sure, but also he tried to, raise the issue here. What common sense is important for the system. Well, the second thing he said, I will withdraw from the world, basically talking about retrenchment, and no longer perform the function as a world police, which also makes huge sense, both in financial terms. Americans, how much they spent on abroad, the foreign military adventures in the past decades. And most of those adventures are grand failures, not even success, starting with Korean War, Vietnam War, you name it, Iraq, Afghanistan. So why they continue to do that? So it's even surprised me that Trump is talking like de Gaulle when he's dealing with NATO today. The thing about 1967, when de Gaulle kicked NATO out of France, because the dispute over commander, the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander position, de Gaulle suggests, we need rotation of the SACEUR. American at that time think de Gaulle was trying to undermine American authority. Now, Trump people are now talking about why not, right? Let Europeans also take charge. So they're willing to pay. They're willing to pay for it. They're willing to take NATO seriously. So I think Trump basic principles of Trump, for me, is good for America. Maybe even good for the world. He is a peacemaker in that sense, fundamentally, because his way of dealing with great power relationship is far more sensible than the democratic regime before. Okay, remember the Biden people The principal Biden administration is the world great power relationship is defined by autocracy versus democracy. That's the most dangerous way to define great power relations. Not even during the Cold War. Not even during the Cold War, they defined in a strict orthodox sense. Yeah? Trump doesn't like ideology, doesn't care. Trump doesn't like wars, and Trump also, does not really give a damn to whatever those, liberal values, the woke culture and so on and so forth. So what's wrong with him? I almost become a MAGA supporter myself in that sense. It may sound strange. In short term, yes, he created huge disruption, chaotic situation. And his behavior is erratical, of course, erratic. But on the other hand, in medium and the long term, it could be good news for US-China relations, which I'm sure will eventually, we are going to come down with what Trump would call grand bargaining. Not just trade bargaining, that's just taking place in Geneva right now, but also grand bargaining, including other most dangerous issues like Taiwan, South China Sea, and all the other issues, security issues. So in the longer term, I'm more optimistic, actually, if Trump can succeed. But we never know. The resistance against Trump within the American system is still quite powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you have to put the current problems or tensions that we're seeing in the Trump administration in some context. I'm not very supportive of the trade war personally. I don't think it's the right way of doing these things. Although the instinct is correct, trade is extremely imbalanced in the world. And actually, I know on this point, the Chinese are, they have their own interests as well. They are running a trade surplus economy, but eventually those things will have to be rebalanced. And I think it's inevitable that there'll be some tension around that. That said, look, a trade war could be pretty chaotic. It could create a recession. It could create inflation. It could do all these things. But last December, the world got, I think, as close as we've ever come to nuclear war when Joe Biden signed off on sending long-range missiles into Russia. We didn't hear about it because the media completely covered it up, but everyone in the rest of the world knew that Western Europe was engaged in some really, really dangerous behavior and may have had a man with advanced dementia actually in the White House. So I really think we need to put trade war in context. Trade wars will blow over. Nuclear wars won't blow over, okay? We'll all end up eating dog food. So I think you should put that in some context. In terms of the tensions themselves, you can frame them in terms of Trump, but I think it's again a kind of a broader issue here, and it's a very long-term historical process, because what's effectively happened is that, to do kind of 250 years of history in 60 seconds, the British Empire took over the world in the 18th and 19th century. It really did, in a sense, take over the world. It didn't fully control everywhere. It didn't fully control China, of course, but it had massive influence in the world, and anywhere that it cropped up, its influence was felt. The British Empire effectively collapsed in the interwar years, gradually, between World War I and World War II. And by the end of the Second World War, Britain was not a global power. And at that point, they handed the keys of the empire over to the United States. Was that wise for the United States to accept those keys? Maybe in the Cold War, maybe not. It's a debate that I'm open to personally. I think the real mistake was made in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, and the Americans then at that point had a very clear choice before them, where they could put the old imperialism to bed or they could turbocharge it. And they decided to turbocharge it, and I think that was one of the worst decisions that's ever been made in America. Sometimes it's called neoconservatism, call it what you want, but that was a decision that was made, and that was a terrible decision, because that's the decision that's basically led to the hollowing out of American power and the American economy. In trade, it's resulted in the things that Trump complains about, hollowing out of the middle class, the massive trade deficits. America's enormously indebted. The massive bloat growth of the federal government. If you ask an American who's been alive for a while if the country's the same before and after 9/11, they'll tell you it's not. It's something that people don't talk about that much in America, and that's directly attributable to the decision to maintain the imperial structure intact. At this point, the imperial structure will collapse no matter what. It is in the process of collapsing, and so it's just a question of how we get to that point. I agree with the professor that Trump has at least floated the ideas that get us away from some sort of an existential crisis if the liberal world order is threatened. That's genuinely dangerous. And when the Biden administration allowed Ukraine to launch those missiles into Russia, you saw just how dangerous that was. These were ideological people willing to risk nuclear war over pretty much nothing. Those missile strikes, sorry to harp on them, but those missile strikes did nothing tactically to change the war. I see military people in the audience. You'll know this. Those missile strikes had no strategic value whatsoever, but they lobbed them in out of ideological madness that probably hasn't been seen since the Bolshevik Revolution, or before that, since the French Revolution. Really crazed mindset, mid-revolutionary mindset. The Trump administration has moved us away from those ideas, thankfully, and I don't think that they're going to re-emerge. I think no matter what happens to Trump now, that moment, that very scary peak liberalism moment of the Biden administration has been put to bed. But there will be conflicts because, look, I'll say it very bluntly, in the very late imperial stage of American development, an inordinate amount of its wealth rested on the use of force, okay? That's just the reality of it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the use of military force, but it means the use of regulatory prohibitions on certain things and so on. The wealth that's being maintained at the moment is not being maintained through normal competitiveness mechanisms that economists would recognize. And so if those forces at play are beginning to self-undermine and beginning to be recognized as being quite poisonous even to America, holding them in the process of unwinding them will probably be a relatively chaotic one. But it's inevitable. All this will play out over the next 10 to 15 years. Maybe over the course of the Trump administration we'll have got to the end to a large extent. But I do think recognizing the problem as a practical problem rather than an ideological one is good. I think the fact that the Chinese are meeting with the Americans in Switzerland, personally, I don't think much will come of it. I think the Trump administration miscalculated here. But at least they're sitting opposite each other and talking about a practical issue like trade. Whereas look at how the Americans and the Russians weren't talking to each other. It was over this ideological conflict, which in my opinion doesn't even exist, but the leadership in America thought it did. So it's a lot easier to solve a practical problem than an ideological problem. So I think we can all be glad for that.
Thank you. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but for time's sake, I will open the floor for the Q&A, and we will collect 1-2 questions at the time, and then whoever is addressed, or both of you, could give their respective answers. So I'm turning to the audience. Are there any questions, comments, notes so far? Two as well. I'm not sure we have a mic. I'll give it myself. There. First, you raise your hands first. Please state your name and ask the question, and then we'll hand it over to the other participant.
Thank you very much. My name is Levente Szabo. And also good afternoon to you, Professor, and good afternoon, Mr. Pilkington. My question would be, as I first read the title, East and West, I obviously thought China and the United States as the two current superpowers of the world. And what do you reckon, so my question would be, what do you reckon, can Europe reach its so-called former glory and become basically the third superpower of the world as a whole? So if Europe were united, can it reach its former glory? Thank you.
Thank you, and there was a question over here.
Good afternoon. So my question would be to the both of you. Do you think it's possible for other countries to find a kind of balance between the West and the East to navigate between them, or eventually they will be set in front of a decision to choose a side similar to the Cold War? Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
as the honorary European. In terms of the question about Europe, again, I'm going to be more blunt than I usually will because we're among friends here. Europe was turned into a vassal state. I don't really know when that happened. I think history books, actually I spoke to an academic at Cambridge recently who's interested in exploring this topic. It'll be an interesting one, and I think his book will go down in the annals, as they say. But over the course of maybe the past 15 years, Europe was turned into a vassal state of the American liberal establishment. Again, I'll be blunt about this. They were not that vassal state even as recently as the Iraq War. You'll remember that the French and the Germans said, we are not getting involved in this war. They convinced a few countries to get involved, but the main leadership in Europe said no. There was an independent Europe at that point. It was still quite subordinated to America due to its Cold War ties and so on, but it wasn't a vassal state. No one could have accused the Europe in the mid-2000s of being a vassal state. It was turned into a vassal state, and it was done so, it seems to me, quite explicitly by promoting certain leaders in halls of power in the major European countries, even somehow creating something resembling a European presidency in the form of Ursula von der Leyen. Maybe people are too young to remember, but Ursula von der Leyen's position did not exist before Ursula von der Leyen. She created it herself. We now have a chief diplomat in Europe that apparently represents all of us, but seems to me to be representing Estonian interests, a country smaller than my own. So Europe, I mean, the long and the short of it is Europe is a complete mess after this vassalization. The other issue is that even the vassalization's not working anymore because the vassals have been tossed in the trash, as the Americans say. The Americans don't need them anymore because they're basically not interested in the Russia question. By the way, of course, Trump accelerated this, but a Kamala Harris presidency would have done the same thing. She would have just been polite about it. The way that the American foreign power projection system works is that it intervenes in a region, and then when it gets sick of that region, it disposes of the previous allies. You can go and look at this at every point in its history, from Vietnam all the way up till today. Korea is a slightly different question, but we could talk about that. Certainly from Vietnam on, this has been the strategy. And so they would have been tossed aside inevitably. But now we currently have this leadership class in Europe that's basically like a headless chicken, because the brain of the chicken, and the analogy is good because the brain of the vassal chicken is very small, obviously, but it has a brain and it can kind of cluck around and fly and it can do a few things. The brain of the chicken's effectively controlled by the puppet master in a sense, and now what's happened is they've pulled out, chicken's head's being cut off and it's running around the room bleeding. Can we put this back together? That's a big question. This is the problem. And this will go to the second question, but Europe should be a single entity in some sense. Maybe it shouldn't be the current European structure. I certainly don't favour more federalisation. That's been a disaster. But Europe should probably be speaking on the world stage with one voice, because otherwise it's just a bunch of countries. And even the largest of them, Germany, France, they're not that big, actually, and they're not that important anymore. So Europe should be able to speak with one voice, but the current structure that's been put in place it's actually catastrophic. The current European leadership are the most isolated of the major powers in the world. They don't, I think it's political director here, Balázs Orbán, says they're fighting an ideological war with the United States, they're fighting a physical war with Russia, and they're fighting a trade war with China. This is craziness. This is the weakest of the players on the world stage right now, and they're behaving like this. So the key question there is whether we can put that back together. If we can't, it'll go to the second question, I think, but we'll do one by one. Make sense?
Yeah, we could. We're short on time, but I think we can push that in. So yeah, go ahead.
Will I merge it? Okay, so that speaks to the second question: can a smaller country like Hungary navigate the new world order in a sense without Europe? I mean, that's the million-dollar question. They may have to. That's the reality. Hungary's particularly well placed to do this. Currently they're advertising the country's trying to play up its Eastern heritage. Of course, it's true, but look, let's all be honest. Hungary is a Western European country. It's so Western European, it's Catholic rather than it's not even an Eastern Orthodox country. So it's of Rome, obviously not Latin-based language or anything, but it's of Rome. It's a Western European country. But it is on the Eastern approaches. It's had a very good history of being able to balance powers. Well, mixed history in the 20th century, but historically a good track record of this. And it's got a keen sense of its own self-interest and it's willing to compromise. I think those are the qualities that make the prospects for Hungary a lot better than some of the other places. The other thing is geographic and economic. The inevitable endpoint of what's happening globally is that the Eurasian continent will be integrated, probably by rail lines. Sea lanes are becoming increasingly less unreliable. You'll see the Houthis in the Red Sea. You'll see all this. It's too much hassle maintaining sea lanes, and they're slow and they're inefficient anyway. So the Eurasian continent will probably be connected by some sort of a land bridge, as they say. America won't like this, but they probably won't have a great deal to say in it. And the key regions there will be the Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe. So, in my opinion, the strategy that Hungary should pursue, if the European strategy fails, or maybe they should do both, is try and recreate Central Europe as a major player in Europe. Not a new Austro-Hungarian empire. That's probably not realistic. It may not be desirable. But basically, as a geographic entity, yes. I mean, that is a very wise thing to do. And I think there's appetite for that, and I think there are gradual moves in that direction. But that's a whole other conversation.
Okay, very briefly, I do believe the problem of EU is largely due to von der Leyen regime. Which I agree with you. Von der Leyen made EU vassal states. But remember, when von der Leyen came to power first time, she had such a great ambition. She said, I want to make EU a geopolitical commission, geopolitical commission, and she emphasized also the principle of strategic autonomy. Now, at that point, China, first of all, is so excited. We like to hear anything. The Europeans say autonomy, both in geopolitical sense or even economic sense. But it turns out, even during the first term of von der Leyen regime, they changed direction almost entirely. Not just because the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That certainly is made part of it, but it is the ideological affiliation, the ideological sympathy with the democratic government in the United States. The first Trump administration tried to deal with EU, but they don't have enough time because Trump was investigated almost non-stop by the Russian, scandal and many other scandals. So the EU since then made two, in my view, strategic miscalculations. One is they believe they can jump on the ship of democracy versus autocracy framework, ship of dealing with great power relations, both in terms of dealing with the Russians and also China. Remember, the EU at that point created a new word of China relationship, something called a systemic rivalry. Americans at that point did not even talk about rivalry in terms of written in the document as such, but it's the EU start talking about a systemic rivalry, which obviously has clear ideological, as I said, Enlightenment Orthodox versus Confucianist China, basically. They try to make it sound like the Biden administration's concept. So that's the first mistake. The second mistake is during the war. No, I mean, I'm not talking about the Ukraine war, but a lot of mistakes they made there. Yeah, but I'm talking about dealing with China after the war in Ukraine. The von der Leyen regime decided to jump on another ship, which is to equate the war in Ukraine directly with Taiwan question. The two events, the two things has zero historic link. The only link you can make, which is, is EU language, today is Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan, right? So the only thing you can make is an ideological argument. That, therefore, Biden himself made 4 times, the White House says a tongue slip, but no, it's not tongue slip, when you made 4 times a commitment saying defending Taiwan. United States government never did that in the past because they followed this very good strategy known as a strategic ambiguity vis-a-vis Taiwan. Because when you abandon strategic ambiguity, which is invented by Henry Kissinger, that's Kissinger's favorite phrase. I used to talk to Henry quite often when I was a Kissinger chair, the Library of Congress. That's his favorite subject. Don't abandon that concept. Okay, it's too dangerous. But Biden administration abandoned. And the von der Leyen regime jumped on that, which is really, really dangerous. I'm talking about the von der Leyen EU actually crossed the red line as far as China's core interest is concerned, which the EU never did before. Okay? So these 2 miscalculations, they have to make up now. They are retreating now. They are talking about restart China relationship. It's good, but the damage is already there. Yes.
Thank you. I think there are lots of food for thought in both your answers and the questions. One of the takeaway I would like to make, and this is just like half a minute, is to, I believe that both in terms of civilizational aspects, I believe we need to be aware of the definitions of the concepts. So not calling them models, not calling them, very clear structures, but actually educate ourselves in them, and including, know thyself, know yourself, the internal ideological political struggles that we have within the West, and particularly in our neck of the woods, so in Europe. In searching for these answers, I highly recommend our 2 distinguished speakers' publications. You find the titles for the upcoming publications as well on our website, on the Ludwig Festival's website, and I do encourage everyone to follow our experts' productivity and academic and political activity as well. Thank you once again for both of you. Thank you for the audience. And the next panel will be on international trade and trade war and disputes in tent number 4. That will be also a stimulating conversation. I encourage everyone to participate in that as well. So thank you once again. Thank you.